for the time zone issue and to be able to pass this on to other members as needed. So my name is Natalie Douglas. I'm honored to know most of you, and we're here today to give a bit of an overview about our working group and to talk a little bit more about what we want to offer in 2025 in terms of collaboration across the greater CATS. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a few slides to share, and then I'm happy to open it up for discussion or any other questions that you may have as we kind of go through this. So this is our implementation science working group that I lead with Christine, who's there at 9:30 at night. So thank you for being with us, Christine. This is the way that we normally do things because I can't stay up past like 9 p.m. So, but Christine likes to stay up later and I can get up early, and she doesn't like to do the opposite. So this is how we work across the world. So it works out very well for us. So we want to give you a little bit about what our working group has been up to and what some of the goals are of our working group. So when we kind of started off with our working group, we thought about three different main activities that would inform each other. So even though they're listed as separate activities, our goal was that these activities would feed in and it would be more of an iterative process and it would inform each other. So we thought that our working group would first conduct original research, potentially. Then we considered how we could support aphasia care in clinical settings. And then we also thought that we should advise research teams throughout CATS. So really, this is where we're going to be spending the majority of our time today and providing some opportunities throughout 2025 to advise all of you and your research teams as would be helpful to you. But we thought that when it came to original research, we would support whatever the next steps were in terms of implementation from current projects, and as well as supporting each other in developing research clinician partnerships. And then we also thought it would be a priority when we think about conducting original research in terms of implementation is to design and test implementation strategies other than education. So we've kind of learned throughout our working group and through the work of many of our members that we have a lot in our field about education and the impact of education in terms of that being an implementation strategy. And that can, of course, be a very powerful strategy, but we want to think about, especially in an international context, what could we do maybe in addition to education, or take a look at some of these other implementation strategies to consider if that would help support aphasia care. The other piece here in supporting aphasia in clinical settings is we really want to think about how we can be a support for clinicians who are working to implement best practices in their settings, connect clinician teams to one another, and then various partner engagement activities. And then we're hoping to provide consultation as needed, depending upon wherever you may land in your implementation project. So this could be support with helping to choose an implementation framework, maybe an implementation strategy or outcome. We also thought it would be a really nice idea to think about how we could not reinvent the wheel across CATS, but rather connect other research teams to one another who are working on similar projects or have similar goals in terms of implementation. So we thought about producing a resource, and I'll talk about a chapter that we have upcoming here in the next couple months. And then we really, throughout all of these initiatives, want to really focus on students and early career researchers in terms of really pushing this type of work forward and supporting students who might be interested in this type of work. So this is really the big picture when we think about our working group. And now we're going to kind of go into back up just a minute to talk about why we even have this working group and the history of it. So some of you may know that one definition of implementation science is how do we study how do we use methods to promote the adoption and integration of evidence-based practices into routine healthcare and public health setting, right? So that's really what we're hoping to do, is to have, if a person with aphasia comes to your setting, we don't want it to be a situation of where you are geographically, the type of care that you receive, right? But ideally, people would receive best practices irrespective of where they are in the world. And in order to do that, we really need implementation science, which is the methods or the scientific study of how we get these evidence-based tools into routine practice. Implementation is really just that process. And I think sometimes you hear the term implementation practice. That term is coming out as of late. It's more of the local tailoring to the context specific. So if you think about implementation science as, the study, thinking about what scientific methods we're using, you can think of implementation or implementation practice as potentially more of the art, thinking about the cultural tailoring of what does it really take to get this into practice. And many of you have kind of heard this statistic that basically what we study as researchers, it does not make its way into routine healthcare settings. It does not make its way into where people with aphasia receive care. So we have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how do we make it happen, if you will, which is a phrase that's sometimes used in the implementation literature. So we know that it takes at least 17 years. This statistic, people can quibble and quabble over it, but I think the bottom line is that we all know as researchers, it doesn't get fully with fidelity into practice enough, nor does it get there fast enough, right? I think we can all agree on that. Clinical guidelines are not adhered to most of the time. When we think about all of the work, and again, just thinking about some of the esteemed researchers, all of you who are on this call, and all of the work, the tireless hours that you have put into clinical guidelines and very rigorous testing of interventions and innovations. And unfortunately, it just doesn't make it to where we need it to go. And that is the crux of our working group, is to try to support that. It's very, very hard to change practice. And as Christine pointed out several years ago now, why is that? Many different reasons, but the environmental context and resources is a huge one, right? And you see this representative quote here that's very powerful. I don't have time to develop aphasia-friendly materials. We don't have appropriate resources for our setting. Beliefs about consequences, right? So these barriers are kind of rooted in the theoretical domains framework. they're just too drowsy in referring to the person with aphasia, too confused to take information in. Social influences. I don't think the family wants aphasia friendly info at this stage. They don't want these details. Sometimes it's knowledge and sometimes it's skills, right? Knowledge, I don't know everything that's involved in the stroke pack, or the specifics within the stroke pack, or I would benefit from more training in modifying information. But I think what you see here is that it's an opportunity for us to get a little bit more creative in terms of what I was saying earlier. Because when you think about what we traditionally do in terms of supporting research moving into practice quickly, we pretty much are almost always focusing here, right? Usually knowledge, right, in terms of workshops and various continuing education opportunities. Sometimes we go here, right, in terms of skills training, in terms of ways to, maybe do role play or a more active session. But very rarely are we thinking about this top part here, thinking about the context, thinking about belief about consequences, thinking about social influences. So I think what we see here is a real opportunity to support one another and to support the rest of the working cats by, yes, of course, not disregarding the need for knowledge and skills, but to think potentially more broadly in terms of what could support implementation, and really looking at what is the barrier to implementation. And perhaps that barrier does not have anything to do with knowledge or skills, but it's more of a context issue. And we can kind of help, hopefully, support implementation through a strategy that better matches the implementation barrier. So we started this group about 3 years ago now, in 2022. And as you saw in our overall charge, we really thought that there was enough evidence in our field and potentially adjacent fields to realize that we really needed to do something very intentional in terms of accelerating research into the practice setting or where people with aphasia receive services. So we have done over the past few years some very similar to what we're doing now, where we've really tried to talk to CATS members to see, what are your implementation priorities and how do we best kind of support some of the rigorous, very high quality work that's already being done in this group, and how do we kind of support an implementation lens on some of that work. So we started off with about 5 or 6 members. So over the past 3 years or so, we've grown to 31 members, which is very exciting. We really primarily have been acting as a community of practice. Since this field is relatively new in aphasia, we spend a lot of our time as a working group in connecting with one another's projects and providing some of that support in terms of next steps, in terms of potential funding mechanisms, in terms of implementation framework, strategies, and outcomes. And we really kind of think about how do we collaborate best to meet the needs of the people in our working group and throughout. So one of the things, the major initiatives that we have taken on is to develop a clinician advisory group. So we developed this group. It really started, I think, at the end of 2023, at the beginning of 2024. And we're still kind of working out how to best leverage the expertise that is in this group. But essentially, at this point, we have a clinician advisory group of about 15 or so clinicians from around the world who are interested in either their own implementation projects, perhaps they're supporting implementation of best practices in their clinical settings, or they are really keen to learn more about implementation. So a couple of our clinicians work, they do have a clinical caseload, but they also work in maybe a quality assurance, performance improvement type setting. So they're looking to gain some of those skills in terms of how do I really tailor these implementation efforts in my particular setting. So we have opportunities if you would like to really get some feedback from a clinical audience. This is another kind of resource for you. So one of the things that we try to be very cognizant of is to approach this from a place of partnerships and considering how to not just receive feedback as researchers, but how to make the experience one of value for the clinicians as well, right? So we don't want to give the impression that we're using clinicians for their clinical expertise to get our research done, which no one would do intentionally. But I think we know both anecdotally and from the literature that it can feel that way at times, right? So this is one of the things that we're continuing to work out over time that is really a complex opportunity, I think, because as we know, when we're all of our work through CATS is the majority, if not all of it, for many of us is volunteer, and we're asking clinicians to volunteer more of their time and expertise and thinking about ways to do that if we can't compensate them monetarily. How, do they want to be an author on a project? Do they want to be acknowledged in a project? Is there something that we could do to maybe do a guest speaker at a continuing education or a professional development that they have going on, right? But we're trying to think about ways to really support the clinical advisory group so that they also find value in collaborating and supporting aphasia research. So far, we have really realized as a working group that these issues of the healthcare system really determine how and what the person living with aphasia receives in terms of their care setting. And so we're very aware that we need some system level innovations. And so we've been working on a paper, Christine and I and a few others too, and it's been very laborious in a challenging but exciting way. We're trying to really figure out, what would a system level innovation look like? If we identify a system level barrier, how do we go about trying to match an implementation strategy to that barrier? And we're finding that even though we work in many different countries across CATS, there are definitely some similarities. And so we really want to leverage the international perspectives that we have represented to think about how we can do that. In the United States, reimbursement is a major driver of care. So thinking about how we can consider that as an implementation barrier, but then also an implementation facilitator. We've really spent some time talking about care transitions and understanding that as the person living with aphasia transitions from the acute care setting into more of a rehabilitation, into a community setting, that these transitions are really key in considering how the person living with aphasia and their family receive evidence-based practice. Context is just so key. We have learned this from every country that's been represented in our group. There is so much to consider when it comes to the role of context and how that is shaping care. There does seem to be an element of clinician knowledge, as we mentioned, as well as clinician preferences. And we all agree that, you know, these individual one-off studies are not the answer to these very complex problems. So we support each other's individual work, certainly, but what we think we have the opportunity to really think through as a working group, and perhaps through the larger CATS, is how do we coordinate these efforts so we don't have a bunch of studies where I study rigorously this particular intervention, then we work through the implementation process, we do barriers and facilitators, we act on some implementation strategies, and then perhaps that particular intervention gets implemented in that one setting. That is good, and we need that, but what can we do to kind of coordinate our efforts, right? So that we can really be strategic in a landscape of very limited resources about how we can support aphasia care on an international level. You know, one last thing that we have realized that is very kind of key to many of the projects that we have been conducting ourselves and learning about through other CATS members is that there's going to be this tension between what is core to the intervention or innovation and what is adaptable, right? And I'm not sure that we do the very best job in identifying those core components in our aphasia literature thus far, but I think that recognizing that there's going to be a tension there. So if I know that these pieces of my innovation are core and they cannot be adapted, right? So even if you want to take this intervention and you want to move it into this context, you have to do A, B, C, or it's no longer the intervention, and we can no longer say that we're even delivering that particular intervention. Versus, well, you got to do this, but maybe you can potentially adjust the frequency or the dose, or maybe you can't adjust the frequency or the dose, or maybe you can adapt the stimuli, or maybe you can't adapt the stimuli, or maybe you can adapt who delivers the intervention. Maybe it could be a volunteer, or it could be a nursing assistant, or maybe it can't. Maybe it has to be a speech language pathologist, right? So really thinking about our interventions themselves, and knowing that there's going to be a tension between what we have to do in the real world, or what is core, and what can we maybe change. And that, we think, is a potential for collaboration and growth in this area. So we do have a book chapter that's coming out. Some of you, I'm sure, are involved in this international aphasia handbook that's coming out through Routledge, where we really kind of try to spell out what this could look like in terms of leveraging implementation science to support aphasia rehab outcomes. So we give some background in this chapter in terms of what implementation science is, why we need it, and then we have 5 case studies that people from our working group have developed to really show what this looks like on the ground when they're really kind of working through applying implementation science. So we have 4 implementation science case studies, and then we have 1 person that gave an example of a quality improvement case study. So that should be coming out if this is something that you think would be helpful to you or your work, I'm happy to check with the editors to see if I can pass you on a draft version, understanding that, you know, we can't share it, or knowing that it's in draft form. If you think that would be helpful to your work, so please just let me know. So one of the things that we did last summer was we had these little mini office hour type sessions that people in CATS found to be really helpful. So we really want to, as we've been saying kind of throughout, support infusing implementation science into whatever project you might have, because we also know that when we think about implementation from the beginning, it's there are better outcomes. And we really want to have a start where you are approach. There are no prerequisites in terms of you have to be here. It's more of a brainstorming, thinking through how we can infuse implementation science wherever you might be. Thinking about implementation and sustainability, you know, from the get-go, from the beginning. And we would love to hear back from folks about if there was any change or impact in terms of our advice. But we did this with about 4 different projects. We had an online version, and then we did it in person. Christine did that, and people really responded well and found it to be a very helpful service. So what we wanted to do in 2025 was to offer kind of quarterly a way for people to do this throughout. And again, if this is something that you look at the times and you think that it's not going to work for you, please feel free to reach out to me and we can work that out. So what we have, I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute so I can show you the Google Doc. We tried to make it so that people could sign up in various parts throughout the world. And we have a session led by one of the people in our working group. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So the first one is actually coming March 12th, so in a couple of weeks. So Anna Volkmer is going to host that for us at 10 Central European time. We're going to be doing something with the CATS hybrid event in June. So depending on how that schedule works out, we're going to offer kind of an in-person and an online option for that. And then we have a session offered in both September and December. So we tried to get something at most quarters of the year. And again, I think if these times don't work for you and you have some questions, I hope you feel free to reach out to me and I can reach out to the rest of the working group, and we can set those up as well. But those were really the kind of key aspects that we wanted to convey today. Christine, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, thank you. That's great. I was just wondering how long the sort of time slots are. I might have missed that. I can't remember.
So the last time we did it, we had like 15 to 20-minute time slots, and then that seemed to be enough. So each host kind of stayed on for about an hour to 90 minutes or so. And I can put this link in the chat if it's easier, along with my email. Yes, is there anything else that I'm missing, Christine? And then we can open it up for any other questions or comments.
No, not that I can think of. Just that it was great. Yeah, running some of those drop-ins has been, I found it really enjoyable to talk to people, just hear what they're up to with their research, what they're thinking. And I think all the conversations were kind of different. Some of them were focused on like frameworks, like quite specific things, because people were using them already. But others were kind of more general. So I think, like you were saying, it doesn't really matter where you're up to.
Yeah, so with that, I'd love to open it up for any other questions or discussion items from any of you. Yes, Katerina.
Yes, hi, Natalie and Kirsten. To be honest, I basically mostly wanted to see you again, so that's why I'm attending. No, but I have a second motivation because, we are invited, to the second level for a grant application, and I wanted to um, take these implantation aspects, into this project. And I'm wondering, yeah, I just signed up for one of the slots in 2 weeks to talk with Anna about the details. But are you planning to have a toolkit for researchers available? I think we once talked about this, to add this to the top resources for clinical trials. So where we can just, you know, as a researcher, we can just pull a set of questionnaires, something like the Roma core outcome set, for outcomes of trials, that we have, tools, a core set of tools that we can use
Mm.
as implementation for probing implementation effectiveness or efficiency in clinical trials.
That is a great question, Katerina. It's very nice to see you as well. It's been too long. Um, I I know what you mean, and I think so. We have been working towards developing something similar to TAP in terms of a website with some key things and some key links. And that has taken longer, I think, like everything does, than we had anticipated. And some of that is because I think what people would like to know in implementation is at quite different levels. So we've struggled a little bit with figuring out the best way in. But anyway, I think we've got a clearer direction around that. But I think for your question, a toolkit is, in my mind, a little bit different, but similar. And that could be really useful as well. So yeah, I guess that could be a little bit more directive. Whereas I think what we're thinking of with the website is a little bit more some of those terms explained. Here could be a link to a paper, but we'll do a little bit. It's kind of a bit more of that education focus as well. So it's quite different to how the TAP one looks. So that is really very interesting. So it's not immediate. It's not on. So a toolkit isn't immediately available, but I can see what you mean. Like what, if you're talking about an implementation effectiveness hybrid
Yeah, like an
study,
interview
yeah,
guideline,
what's
something
something you
like
could
that, because
use?
the major
Mm.
barrier for a researcher is time. And so I'm very willing, to implement implementation science in my trials, but I don't have the time, to read,
Yeah, and I
many
think,
papers. And so I would be happy if you say, okay, here's an
yes,
interview
I think
guide.
let's,
Here's a
yeah, and
questionnaire for
yeah.
clinicians who are carrying out the intervention. Sorry, I'm maybe a
No,
little
that's
superficial, but
perfect. Though, because I think we, in our group, we would collectively have a lot of that knowledge. Like I could tell you right now, some interview guides you could use, and some questionnaires, and some outcome measures. So, I think that knowledge is there, and hopefully with these sessions, like, that we're going to start having once we see some of these, I guess, frequently asked questions coming up, that will also help us to say, actually, here's some resources that people can access easily, that we can just make available. So that, I think that will be really helpful. So exciting that you are signed up, and yeah, we'll keep thinking about what we could do make something like that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it would also be great if CAT hosts like a resource for different languages, like the measures database that we have, that not everybody in a country has to adapt these tools to their native language, so we can share them within our CATS community. That would be very efficient too.
Yes, it's a really great point. Very well taken. And I think it's helpful for Christine and I because it's so easy because there's so many needs from so many different types of individuals in this process, right? But if we think about the priorities of CATs being trialists, right, to give them to kind of focus on that first and think about I just dropped some in the chat. It was funny. I laughed when Christine said we could tell you some of those. So I just dropped some interview guides and surveys and tools based on some frameworks just very quickly. But that is definitely something that we could do. So that's really important. That's important feedback for us. So thank you for that. Any other questions, comments, feedback, considerations?
Hey.
Hi.
Yeah. This is really excellent. I totally hear what you're saying about individual one-off studies aren't the answer, and it's probably better to use something like CATS to think about aphasia care more internationally. But the position I'm in, although I'm an experienced clinician and interested for a long time in how things get implemented in the real world, I'm a PhD student as well, so I am working on a one-off study. But even you just saying, what is core, what is adaptable, just gets me thinking about how you can maybe factor that kind of thinking in from earlier on, and how this group might help me with that. And then I'm thinking about ways that maybe you could feed back into the group, because the work I've been doing in the PhD on implementation science, you see that a lot of the implementation problems, when you think about sustainability and scalability, they quite quickly become kind of systems level problems. So thinking about that earlier from the start would be really, really good to get some help with that kind of thinking, to think more clearly what is adaptable to then, sustain or promote the intervention that I'm working on in particular, and maybe learning from that could help other people's projects. Is that the kind of vision you have?
Absolutely. Yes, very much so. That's exactly it. Because I think was not used to thinking that way, right? It is a bit of a shift, right? And what do we absolutely need to do versus what can we, sometimes that's referred to as form and function, right? So you want the function of the intervention or the innovation or whatever it is, that has to stay according to how it was studied, but the form might take different shapes, right, depending on the context, and still have the effectiveness. But of course, those are all empirical questions, right?
So this is why that kind of, I don't know, it seems like slightly bigger thinking than the position I'm in at the moment, if you know what I mean. So I'm interested in telehealth. I've been interested in worked on telehealth projects for a long, long time, and they're really hard to implement, basically. But then if I think about the international context, I don't know what the remuneration is for telehealth in America or Korea, for example, but it probably isn't remunerated. So those kind of that kind of international collaboration and knowledge with what is adaptable, I think I might find it, I would benefit from.
Yes, thanks, Richard. Julie, I saw your hand.
Okay. I'd like to say something to that about television or online therapy and things. I have a mentee in Kenya, And she has such a huge area that she has to cover that it could, as though possibly online therapy would be the better of the, also better for her patients and for her than the actual, therapy, the traditional kind of therapy, because she has patients that have to come hundreds of miles to the hospital for their treatment, and many of them give up and they can't afford it, and it's too hard on them and then on the family. And so it could be that even compensation there, I mean, when we're looking at the whole world, there are different contexts for that too. And I know in Germany, for some reason, the health insurance companies were not at all against treating patients online, but for some reason they didn't like getting I can't think of seminars and things for continuing education. They didn't like that online. I don't know why, but so there are different attitudes for different reasons for this. And so it might be a help to push for the equal treatment of both of these methods.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say, where there's probably system level strategies which would be across these systems and contexts.
Mhm.
Because I know delivering telehealth in Kenya is, there's lots of different factors there basically to doing it in a different country. But is there some? So it's really interesting what you're saying about you're looking at systems level strategies and whether that's possible. Is that a paper that
Yeah.
you're doing at the moment, or is that in the chapter that you were talking about?
It's in the chapter. Do you have a paper about that, Christine, though? Kind of, maybe.
No, not really. I
No?
think
Okay.
no, I think it's just been a topic of conversation. I was just emailing Jacqueline about in the cats retreat in Sweden. I was just trying to remember where it was. In June. We're going to run a bit of an interactive discussion on systems level change and sustaining change. Not that we have all the answers, but we're going to have a session where we hope to bring and get feedback from people on what things they have found work. We've had some interesting conversations in our group, for example, on lobbying for change, government lobbying and thinking bigger. And I think, that is something potentially for cats that we could have the power to do something like that, like we've seen in other countries, in the European guidelines and things like that. Sometimes there's an opportunity where you do get asked to give feedback on some things. And so I think, having a bit of an open forum and discussion, because it's just not something we've really looked at in our field. And I think that there's a lot of other work that we might be able to draw from, and there's some things that have been successful, and it's difficult, right? I mean, if it was easy we could do it, but hopefully we want to get some more of those conversations certainly happening. So not an answer, sorry.
I wish I could come to Sweden, but I can't.
We're going to do it hybrid as well. And
Okay.
but again, something we could follow up, I guess, with individually. If you're thinking about your own studies, like that's starting small, but it's still important. Something that we sometimes do is when we're interviewing, I guess that's an easy way to bring in that implementation lens, is by interviewing stakeholders, clinicians. And if you're working in different services, what do you think? How would it work here? Why wouldn't it work? That might be an easy way to bring some of those questions you're wanting answered in, without changing too much else of what you have to do for your study, and give you some ideas about where to go to next.
All right, well, we really appreciate, oh yes, Mark.
Sorry, a late hand. I was just going to say, I don't have a lot to say, just to say thank you really for offering this. I recognise that this is an area of knowledge and skill that I lack at the moment. So, and I'm trying to kind of develop that knowledge and skill. So I'm kind of on the verge of hopefully applying for some funding to develop some methodological knowledge in this area in the UK. Because our major health research funder kind of recognises that this is a key area that health researchers need to develop core knowledge and skills in. So, and I think so that would involve kind of formalized training and an opportunity to work with methodologists in the UK and abroad. But I think what you're offering is fantastic because it applies that within the field of aphasia. And so you're offering opportunities to really understand how to translate that knowledge within our field. So that is so complementary to what else might be on offer for somebody like me. So just thank you, and I will be in touch to take advantage of your considerable knowledge and skills, your expertise in this area. So it's really exciting, and I think to have some resources on the CATS website would be fantastic. Just some kind of introductory, these are the core things to look at, these are the main papers to give you an introduction to this field, or yeah, so thanks.
Well, thank you. That's lovely, and that's very exciting to hear that from a systems level, right, that the UK is interested in supporting and funding this type of work. That's a big deal, and maybe that can be a model for other countries or other systems. It's great.
Yeah.
And I think you raise another really good point too, that a lot of this work and implementation, it doesn't have to do with aphasia, right? So it's very tricky, right? Because many of our interventions are complex. They're complex social, behavioral. Some of the innovations that we have, we purposefully don't want them to be over medicalized, right? And so it's very tricky to apply some of these principles. Yeah. Oh yeah, Christine, that's a great point too, in terms of grant support, yeah. Oh, oral health.
Yeah, I think it's just that point of it. A lot of those skills are transferable. So yeah, it doesn't, I mean, we all work in aphasia, but yeah, we can help others outside of aphasia and vice versa. You could get support from somebody else, but like you say, maybe having that in the specific field could also be beneficial. Yeah. I've got to run because my laptop's about to die, so I just want to say goodbye to everybody. Nice to see you, and I'll let you finish up the meeting.
Now you can put your jammies on.
Yes.
Christine, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Are there any other final thoughts before we wrap up? Great. Well, we appreciate you all so much for giving the time, and we really look forward to working with you. I'm going to send this recording on to Jacqueline over at CATS, so you can feel free to share it with colleagues or other people. The same with the sign up sheet for the individual times, and of course my email if those times don't work and we want to set up something else. So thank you so much again, and look forward to working with you all more closely very soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All right, thanks
Hosting
everybody.
this meeting. Bye-bye.
Of course, bye-bye.